Alright, so this is our final video lecture for the semester, and we're going to talk about regulation. So we've talked a lot about markets, and we know that markets are pretty good at allocating resources and providing goods and services for society. But we also know that sometimes the market doesn't necessarily produce an outcome that is ideal. It may be efficient, but it's not necessarily equitable. It's not necessarily fair. And so we see certain problems arise that we may decide, you know what, we need to step in, and rather than just letting the market run free, we're going to impose certain rules and regulations that either the producers or the consumers in the market for the good or service must follow in order to address some problem. So regulation in general, we can break it down into two categories. There's just strictly economic regulation and social regulation. So economic regulation is going to target, more directly something about the price or the quantity of the good or service that's being produced. Whereas social regulations are going to address more ethical considerations. Now, an example of an economic regulation would be a price control. And there's two types of price controls. The first is a price floor. All right, and we are going to implement a price floor when we think that the price of something is too low. All right, so what we're saying is that the market's trying to drive the price down, and we're going to put a floor in place to prevent the price from falling any lower. All right, so price floor is a minimum, and the best example of this is a minimum wage. Right, the market for labor, right, for workers. There's going to be supply and demand of workers, just like there's supply and demands of goods and services. Well, the market forces may result in a price of labor, a wage, that is deemed too low. All right, now that's a normative consideration, but it's one that society is free to make. So if we determine that the wage that's set by the market is too low, then we can implement a price floor. Now, to be effective, we've got to make sure that we impose that price floor above the market equilibrium price. Because if we were to set a price floor below the market equilibrium price, well, the market wasn't wanting to go that low to begin with. All right, so we need to look at what's the current price, and if we deem it too low, then we need to set a price above that market equilibrium price, and that represents our price floor. Now, the problem is that when you artificially change the price in a market, we're going to see a response on both the supply and the demand. So remember, if we are imposing a price floor, so we're saying you have to, offer a higher price, either buy or sell at a higher price. On the supply side, with a price floor, with an increase in price, you're actually going to get an increase in the quantity supplied. If you're saying to the market you have to pay a higher price, that's going to encourage suppliers to want to supply more of the good or service. On the other hand, on the demand side, when you increase the price, remember that quantity demanded goes down. Fewer people will be willing to pay that higher price. Now, what does this mean for the market? Well, you're raising the price, artificially. You're raising it above what the market wanted to set. That leads to an increase in the quantity supplied and a decrease in the quantity demanded. So that means at that higher price, at that price floor, there's going to be more people willing to sell, but not as many people willing to buy, which means you end up with what we call a market surplus. At that price, there's just too much that's trying to be sold, not enough demand. And so this is a problem, when you think about the labor market, because a surplus of labor is what we call unemployment. Right? So a minimum wage is a price floor, and based on simple market theory, a price floor leads to a surplus, and in the market for labor, that would be unemployment. Now, that's the microeconomic effect of something like a price floor. It doesn't stop there, because we've got to think, well, how might this result in changes in other markets? And so with the minimum wage in particular, one thing we've got to keep in mind is that while the microeconomic theory says this price floor leads to a surplus of labor, unemployment, well, that still means there's going to be some workers who are earning higher wages. And recall from our discussion of determinants of demand that when people earn more money, what do? They spend more. And when some people start spending more, it actually leads to higher production and higher employment in other parts of the economy. So a price floor, again, we set that when we think the price is too low. the result will be a surplus in the market. Now, a price ceiling is the exact opposite. This is what we impose when we think the price is too high. So the market's trying to push the price up, and we put a ceiling in place to prevent it from rising any further. An example of this would be like rent control on apartments. Okay. Now, the problem with a price ceiling is that you're imposing a price that is lower than the market price. And if you lower the price, we know that on the supply side, we're going to get a decrease in the quantity supplied. There will be fewer people willing to sell at that lower price. But on the demand side, you're actually going to have an increase in the quantity demanded, because when the price is lower, more people are willing to pay. And so what you get is an increase in quantity demanded, a decrease in quantity supplied, and the result is a shortage. It means there are more people trying to buy the product at that lower price than there are willing to sell. And so what that means in an example of rent-controlled apartments, all of a sudden there's going to be a whole lot, more demand for those rent-controlled apartments, but obviously there's only so many apartments, to go round. Or there's only so many people that are going to be willing to accept a lower price for those apartments. So price controls, like I said, are an example of an economic regulation. We're targeting a specific part of the market, that price outcome. Another example of an economic regulation might be a quota, where we say there's either some minimum amount or maximum amount that the market must produce or will be allowed to produce. Now, social regulations, on the other hand, I said these are going to be targeted at more ethical concerns, and so this is going to cover things like working conditions, worker safety. Right? We impose regulations on how certain products are made to make sure that the people who are actually making the product aren't going to be hurt in the process. Or there may be product safety regulations, so that when people buy and consume the product, that they don't get sick or injured or die. So again, trying to protect the safety of the workers, trying to protect the safety of the consumers, right? It's not a matter of what the price and quantity is. It's about, the health and well-being of people. Another social regulation might be environmental laws. So we have to make sure that when we produce certain goods or services, that we're not creating pollution or damaging the environment. And again, that's an ethical consideration that we take into consideration. That just sounds silly, doesn't it? But again, if there's something of concern other than just the strict economics, other than the price of the quantity that the market's producing, if there's some ethical concern, then we have tools at our disposal to try and address that problem. Now, when it comes to regulation, obviously, we know that regulations, recall, are a determinant of supply, and if we increase regulations, it will decrease the supply of the good or service, which leads to a lower quantity and a higher price. Well, now we have an economic impact. So then we have to think about, well, on the one hand, what are we trying to achieve with the regulation, right? Let's say that we're trying to limit pollution, right? Well, what's so bad about pollution? Well, remember from our discussion of negative externalities that if we're producing cement and production of cement pollutes the air, that makes people sick. They get asthma, lung disease, and then they have to spend a lot of money getting medical treatment. So we may say, well, we want to impose this regulation because there are all of these additional healthcare costs, right? There's this social cost being imposed on people that may have nothing to do with cement. So we want to try to address that negative externality. So maybe we'll, impose a pollution regulation, saying the cement kiln, the cement company has to install new technology, right? Well, we can certainly do that if we believe that the healthcare costs are too great, but then we have to take into consideration, what's that going to do in the market for cement? Is it going to hurt the ability of the cement kiln to produce cement, and are they going to have to charge a ridiculously high price? And then, what's the impact in, construction and roads and buildings? We need cement, and if we're having to pay higher prices for the cement, that's going to translate into higher prices of roads and bridges and buildings. So when it comes to crafting an effective regulation, we have to perform a basic cost-benefit analysis. We've got to think about, in this example, how much money are we going to save from eliminating or reducing the pollution and avoiding all of that healthcare cost, right? We can quantify that to say, all right, we're going to reduce the number of people with asthma, and that translates into X amount of dollars in savings. Right? So that's the benefit, right? We can measure it, but then what's the cost, right? What is this going to do to, the construction industry? What is this going to do to local government's ability to, fix roads? Okay, so we've always got to weigh the cost and the benefit of any rule or regulation that we're going to put into effect. And then another, just side comment on regulation is, you may impose a regulation on the production or consumption of something, and you can be pretty confident that either the producer or the consumer is going to try and find a way around that regulation, right? We're always trying to find a loophole or something, and so sometimes you may, write a rule or a regulation, and you may not consider every contingency, every possibility, and basically people just find a loophole and they go right around it, and then you're right back to where you started, trying to figure out, well, is there additional rules or regulation, and again, what's the cost and the benefit? Now, the last topic we'll cover has to do with monopoly. And so we talked about the social costs of monopoly. We know that when we have a monopoly market, the cost for society is that monopolist will choose to produce less of the good or service than a competitive market would, and they're very likely going to charge a price that's higher than a perfectly competitive market. Now, in some cases, we can just shut the monopoly down. So 100 years ago, we have the Sherman Antitrust Act, which allowed the federal government to step in and start breaking up companies that had a monopoly in their industry. So whether it was oil or railroads or steel. So we can just step in and literally, bust the monopoly, right? We can break them up into other companies that will then be forced to compete against each other. But remember also that one reason why monopolies might arise is because they are a natural monopoly, right? There's something about what they're producing that has allowed them to enjoy great economies of scale, which means they can produce a whole lot of their product at a very low cost, and it may not necessarily make sense for another firm to come in and try and produce the exact same thing. So in this case, we might want to try to find a way for society to coexist with the natural monopoly. So we want to say, okay, natural monopoly, you're doing your thing, you're enjoying economies of scale, that's great. You're producing something that people want or what people need, but we don't want you to raise the price too much. We don't want there to be too much of a cost to society with the higher prices. And so what we can do is price regulations. And so the textbook covers this in a little bit more detail, but there's a couple different options. And so we may say, okay, here's how much of the good or service that we want you, the monopoly, to produce. All right, so at that quantity, what's the marginal cost, right? So we may say we're going to let you charge a price that is equal to the marginal cost of producing the very last unit, okay? Now the problem is they may be losing money, right? There may be a quantity with the marginal cost where the marginal cost is actually still below the average total cost curve, right? And that means they're going to be receiving a price that's less than their cost per unit. So obviously, no firm is going to want to stay in business if we limit their ability to even, break even and cover their costs. So another option is to use what we call average cost pricing. So whatever the quantity is that the monopolist will produce or that we ask them to produce, we'll say, okay, what's your average cost per unit? Okay, that's what the average cost is, then that's what your price is going to be. All right. So at the very least, the monopolist breaks even. Okay. In terms of economic profits. Now the problem with these cost pricing is that if we just say, okay, the price is going to be whatever it is, whatever the cost is for the monopolist, well then what we've done is we've removed the incentive for the monopolists to try and manage its costs. Because if something happens and their costs go up, well, what do they care? They're just going to charge a higher price, right? So obviously that's still going to be bad for society because we want to encourage them to try and lower their costs. And so the final option we have, and in your book kind of talks about two different forms of this. I like to call it just a simple rate of return pricing regulation. So what we say is, okay, monopolist, here's the quantity that you want to produce or we need you to produce. What's your cost per unit? Okay, so we measure their cost per unit, and then what we do is we allow them to charge a price that is a little bit above that cost per unit, right? We look at all the other industries and ask, okay, what kind of rate of return is being generated in other industries, whether they're very similar to the monopolist or not. And we're going to say, okay, to make sure that you, the firm, can generate enough of a rate of return to satisfy your investors and your shareholders, we're going to say, okay, take your average cost and you can charge a price that's a little bit above that, okay? And that price will usually be locked in for a period of time. And what that is going to encourage the monopolists to do is that as long as they're able to charge this price, and this is their cost per unit, right? Well, if this price is locked in for a period of time, now they're going to have an incentive to try and lower their costs. And then at some point in the future, we reevaluate and we set a different price. But that way, we as a society get the good or service. It's still produced privately. The monopolist is allowed to generate a reasonable rate of return, and so we minimize the social cost of that monopoly. We take advantage of the economies of scale, and we try to mitigate the social cost. Now, the very last thing we might be able to do is if we determine that a good or service represents a natural monopoly, there's economies of scale, we may just provide it publicly. Right, so we've already got positive externalities, things like public education that we provide publicly. We have public goods that are non-rival and non-exclusive, right, that we provide publicly. And now we finally have a third reason that a government, society, provides something publicly because of the nature of the good or service. So think about water lines in a city. Obviously, it doesn't make sense to have competing water systems, to have different water companies providing different households with their water, because that would mean you'd have, how many, 2, 3, 4 different possible water lines coming into your house. That's ridiculous. It's redundant, right? So we recognize that it makes sense to only have one system to deliver water to households and businesses. Right? Well, water, is something that's pretty necessary, right? It's hard to do without water. And so rather than allowing a private firm to generate profits from the provision of water, what we do is we say, okay, we're going to provide water publicly, and so the government will set up kind of a little mini public firm, and they go out, they require the resources they need, they build all the infrastructure they need to deliver the water, and then we step in and we say, okay, this publicly provided good or service is going to be sold at a price that is equal to the cost per unit, right? And in this case, because it's being provided publicly, we don't have to worry about generating a rate of return. All we need to do is make sure that we're providing the good or service at a sufficient quantity, and that we're charging a price to the consumers that is just enough to cover the cost per unit. And with that, we conclude our discussion of regulations.